By the time you've made it to the river, you've had a few chances to gain information and narrow your opponent's potential range of hands. If you haven't already, watch the previous lessons, as there's no point in learning how to play the river if you aren't playing the flop and the turn properly. When it comes down to the river, first you have to decide if your hand is ahead or behind of your opponent's potential holdings. Then you must decide how to play the river. One key concept to be aware of is that generally speaking, pots are bigger on the river. This means that decisions are magnified and river mistakes are much more costly than earlier street mistakes. This is why it is imperative you do a good job of acquiring information throughout a hand, because you want to be making your best decisions when the money is the biggest. The river is the worst time to miss a value bet, so make sure you know where you're at. On the river, your decisions are in an all or nothing format. Either you have the best hand and you have 100% equity, and any money that goes in on the river will be returning to you, or you don't have the best hand, you have 0% equity, and all money put into the pot will be lost. There is no semi-bluffing on the river, no backup plans. You're either good or you're beat. And this is what makes proper river play so important. The stakes are high and the equity is very skewed. You can of course bluff the river and pick up a ton of equity if you're successful. But to make a good river bluff, all signs from the hand must be pointing to our opponent is not looking to call a big bet here. Otherwise, bluffing is a spew. For the record, I almost never bluff at rivers because the risk is just so high, and if I've made it to the river, I probably have a hand I'm happy to show down. Like, if you find yourself constantly getting to the river with weak hands and being forced to bluff and getting caught, you need to ask yourself, how did I get here? And make sure you aren't getting yourself involved in bad spots unnecessarily. So first, let's look at what to do when we have the best hand. If we are in position, the decisions are pretty straightforward. We should call when our opponent bets if we think we are beating 50% of his hand range or more. And when I say his hand range, I mean his range for betting on the river. A lot of people will only bet super strong hands on the river. They will check all like one pair hands and bet their bluffs. So what's important, more so than just all the hands he could have, is which hands is he betting on the river, and how does our hand fare against that range of hands? This is actually a pot odds spot. When I said 50%, that's just kind of a general number. What you want to do is add your opponent's bet to the pot size to get the total pot size, and divide by the size of the bet, because that is how much you have to call. This is the odds of how often you must show a winner to make a long run plus EV call. So if they bet half the pot, you must show a winner one time out of 4 to break even. As a side, let's say we have like bottom pair, but like 90% of our opponent's holding are missed draws. Then it's fine to call a river bet, even if we only have a bluff catcher, such as like bottom pair, because we expect to win that pot 90% of the time, and even if they bet full pot, we only need to win about 1 out of 3. We should raise our opponent's river bet only if our hand is strong enough to play if they re-raise our river raise. By making a raise on the river, we reopen the betting, and we only want to do that if we have a hand that's strong enough to deal with the consequences of getting re-raised again. Otherwise, the best play is typically to just call and show down the hand. If our opponent checks to us, we should typically bet if we think we have the best hand. The only time we shouldn't bet is if our opponent won't call us with a worse hand. So that first statement isn't fully accurate, and I'll go into why right now. Against some very tight players, they will fold strong hands to river bets, but only call with quite good hands, super strong hands. So we have to be careful how thin we are value betting, by which I mean how weak of a hand we are betting on the river. Against some people, betting top pair, top kicker on the river is not a good idea, because you only want to bet the river if you know your opponent is capable of calling you with a worse hand. We don't want to be making river bets that will only get called by better hands. If our opponent won't call with worse, we gain 0 value by betting and just lose money the times that we are beat. Just because we think we have the best hand doesn't mean we have to bet it. A good example is if we think our opponent's range is 90% missed draws and we'll say 10% sets. Well, even if they check to us and we have 2 pairs, checking behind would be correct. If we bet, 90% of the time they fold and we win the same amount we would have if we checked behind. The only value we gain is not having to show our hand. But 10% of the time we lose the extra money that we bet when we could have just checked and seen a free showdown. When we are out of position, the river play gets a lot more complicated. To play the river properly, we have to guess what our opponent's ranges for calling a river bet and betting the river themselves are. If we have, say, top pair, top kicker, and we know our opponent will only call the river bet with 2 pair or better, but will bet all weaker top pair hands and bluffs, then we would want to check to them and call rather than bet out, because if we bet out, they're going to fold all the stuff we beat so we don't gain value. But if we check, they will bet a lot of hands that we want value from that we can call. So if your opponent will call with more hands that we beat than he would bet himself, we should bet the river. And if your opponent will bet with more hands that we beat than he would call our bet with, we should check the river with the intention of calling or raising. And if the stack sizes are right, that to go all in, you must go for a river check raise because there's like 2 bets left and you think your opponent's aggressive and he will bet a lot when you check him on the river. You should go for it. Sure, it sucks when your opponent checks behind, but if they're the aggressive type, they'll often give you that bet you were looking for. Next, we'll look at what to do when we don't think we have the best hand. If we are out of position, generally speaking, we should just check and fold. If, however, you've been representing a strong hand and your opponent has been showing no strength in the hand, it might be okay to bluff the river. Remember that a pot-sized bluff must be successful at least 50% of the time to be profitable. So I would suggest only bluffing the river out of position if you think there is a 60% chance or better that your opponent is ready to fold. Remember, when you're out of position, you don't have as much information, so it's a lot tougher. Also, bet the amount you would if you had a strong hand. These are the most effective bluff sizes. If you always bet small when you have a good hand and big when you're bluffing, people are going to see through that. They're going to pick you off. This comes down to your opponent's range of hands, which you've narrowed. And with experience, you will see what strength of hand which opponent types need to make a river call. So you can know, maybe that they will fold 75% of their river range because they have top pair, middle pair, or 2 pair, but they're only going to call a river bet with 2 pair, which they have a quarter of the time, or something like that. So with experience, you can learn about that. Remember, if you've been check calling and you make a random donk bet at the river when you brick out because you know you won't win the pot by checking, your hand doesn't make any sense, and you're probably going to get looked up because it's only one more bet. Even if it is a big bet, it's still just one bet. Don't waste money on desperation bluffs. Just because you can't win a pot by checking doesn't mean you have to bet it. If we are in position and our opponent has bet into us, our decision is easy. Fold and move on to the next hand. And what about if our opponent checks to us? Well, if our hand looks weak and our opponent is capable of checking the river to induce a bluff, like we do against fishy type players, save your money and check behind. If, however, our hand looks strong and our opponent's looks weak, maybe, they've check called the flop and the turn and they've checked to us on the river again, which usually isn't that strong a hand, then the same rules apply from before. We want to have at least a 60% success rate, so we do get some profit from our bluffs. We don't just want to be breaking even on our bluffs. And we want to bet the same amount we'd bet with a real hand. Generally speaking, you shouldn't be bluffing at the river, but to ensure we get action, we have to get caught bluffing sometimes. If we only show down the nuts, players will adjust and stop giving us action. That being said, remember that decisions are magnified to the max on the river, and it's the last place you want to make a mistake. Make sure you gather information cheaply and early, so when you make it to the river, you will have a very good idea of where you stand versus your opponent's potential holdings. I hope this has been helpful. Grips.com signing out.